Welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's Public Lectures programme. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the Public Lectures Committee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our latest event. Some housekeeping first of all. Please would you ensure your phones are in a silent mode? We're expecting a fire drill. In the event of a fire alarm, please join us in the car park to my left outside. We're on Insights at InsightsNCL on Twitter, and you can hashtag us InsightsNCL. Many of you were here this time last year virtually, for our last defence lecture. We had Lord Robertson, former Secretary of NATO, Secretary General of NATO, and former Defence Secretary, speaking on can we manage a very dangerous world. Arguably, things have developed further since that lecture, and Robertson himself, not I think because of the lecture here, has been charged with overseeing the 4th Defence Review in 10 years. A defence review taking place with war in Europe and the threat of war in the South China Sea. In the last 24 hours, Vladimir Putin has gone from being a pariah figure in the West to being an interlocutor in peace negotiations, treating an invasion as if it were a mere disagreement. This, of course, is a consequence of the change of administration in the United States. And the Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, US Defence Secretary, met our Defence Secretary, John Healey, yesterday. And he said to the press, quote, he's here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. There are very major questions for us to consider this evening. We, in the past, have had academics, service personnel, and other parties who've given defence lectures. We've found, our experience has been that service personnel are usually better once they've retired. There's a candour which they speak with, which is rather constrained by wearing a uniform. But on this occasion, we have someone who was quite candid in uniform. And our speaker has given very resonant interviews and speeches and coining notions such as this being a, quote, 1937 moment. He talked about there being a pre-war generation in Britain, and many of these quotes were misconstrued and misinterpreted. He suggested preparatory steps to enable placing our societies on a war footing, and that some sense of national service, not conscription, but national service, was, quote, not merely desirable, but essential. We had a session with our students beforehand, and he used a very wonderful phrase which I want to end my introduction on. This is not a world safe to be a vegetarian in. To deliver the 2025 Defence Lecture, Defending the UK in Unprecedented Times, General Sir Patrick Sanders.
Well, thank you. Thank you to so many of you for coming. Is this working? Yes. Good. All right. We'll shout if it doesn't. So it's a real honour to be here. I'm sure everybody says that. It genuinely is. I mean, first of all, on two counts. If you've grown up or spent 40 years in uniform, particularly as an infantryman as I have, you know that this is the heartland. I mean, I really mean the heartland of the British Army. In particular, from an infantry perspective, worth reminding ourselves that the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers had 52 battalions serving in the First World War and 10 in the Second World War. And the DLI, one of the precursors to my own regiment, had 42 and 15 respectively. My father was a Fusilier and I'm a rifleman, so it feels like I've come home. And then it's also slightly odd to find myself giving a lecture at a university, given that my own experience at university was short. I was on a cadetship, which is one of these things where the army pays for you to go to university at Exeter, and I lasted for precisely 1 year and was then thrown out and given the choice of either going straight to jail, Sandhurst, or paying the 200 quid back, and I went straight to jail, and it stood me in good stead. The irony of the story is that I received a letter from the Vice-Chancellor about a year ago inviting me to get an honorary doctorate from Exeter. So I wrote back saying, I'm hugely honoured, thank you, very flattered. But it might be best for all concerned if you just quietly withdraw the offer, because if you check your records, you'll find that I wasn't very distinguished. And she said, I don't know, we know. We know. We're not that stupid. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience. So I found myself in the course of one day going from failed undergraduate to doctor, and then by tea time I was a professor, or an honorary professor anyway. So I want to preface, most of what I talk about today is going to be gloomy. I mean, geopolitics are trending down. But I wanted to sort of preface this by saying that I think of myself as an optimist. Not everything I've said is optimistic, but I do think of myself as an optimist. After all, 40 years of serving alongside Geordies does tend to rub off on you. And I want to try, before I get into the darkness, just to light a bit of a candle before we get on to cursing the darkness. Because in many respects, we've been lucky enough to grow up, if you're alive now, you've been lucky enough to grow up in what has been a golden age. We've had 80 years of relative peace and prosperity. Why? Well, most people associate Thomas Hobbes with some quite bleak philosophy, but he said something interesting. He said, so long as there is no overarching authority to provide peace and stability, the life of man is sure to be solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. And what we've been lucky about is that we have had that overarching authority to provide peace and stability. And it's been a function of two things. First of all, the Bretton Woods post-World War II institutions that have kept us safe. And secondly, a United States of America that has broadly been engaged and outward facing in the world. And both of those two things are now under severe threat and possibly are breaking if they haven't broken already. But when I talked about it being a 1937 at the moment, when I took over as CGS, the point I was trying to make is that we still have time, because we did have time in 1937, and we still have agency. So with that spirit of optimism, I'm going to channel my inner Hugh Grant as the Prime Minister of Love, actually, and remind ourselves that although we as the UK are no longer a great power, and we're not, we have got some things going for us. And we should keep these in mind as we fret about the future and the world. We are still the 5th largest economy in the world. We are still members of the Permanent Five, the G7, the G20, NATO, and we are connected deeply to the Commonwealth. We have friends, not least in NATO, expanded now from 12 to 32 members. It's a sign of an alliance that is the healthiest it's ever been. We have, sitting here, one of our superpowers is, of course, our higher education and our universities, among the most admired in the world. We are better at life sciences and AI than almost any nation on earth. We are the 3rd in the world at AI research. And when you measure us for soft power, the global soft power index, we consistently come in the top 3. France does as well, so it's not that high an achievement. But we are 2nd or 3rd with France. English is the global lingua franca. We're a nuclear power. We have outstandingly professional armed forces. So we have solid foundations, but there are some things that we should worry about. And the first is that we're now seeing a re-emergence of Axis powers, an axis consisting of the so-called CRINC, so China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and they are all nuclear or on the threshold of nuclear. We're seeing the rise of autocracies and the decline of the liberal enlightenment. We've had to watch the horrors inflicted by Iranian-backed militias, Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as the appalling suffering of the Palestinian people. We're now seeing war in Europe for the first time since the end of the Second World War, and we face the prospect of a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific, potentially in the next 5 to 10 years. And the war in Europe has taken over 1 million casualties, and issues like sovereignty, territorial integrity are being cast to the winds by the very country that was a founding member of the UN Charter, that signed the Helsinki Accords, and it brings to mind Thucydides' Melian dialogue. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. So I think we are at a fork in the road. It is a 1937 moment, but we still have got time. And it's worth recalling what Kissinger said. He wrote, "A nation which does not shape events through its own sense of purpose eventually will be engulfed in events shaped by others." And that is what we risk at the moment. So how do we address this? Well, the way that the government has chosen to address it structurally is through the SDR. I'm going to sort of just talk through the SDR as we get further and further into this. But the SDR, led by three people I know very well. Many of you will have seen George Robertson's St. George of the 1997 review. Quite why he's chosen to take this one on is slightly beyond me. Fiona Hill, not far from this parish, and Richard Barrons, who I've spent much of my time serving with. I know them, I admire them, they are very formidable people, but they face a really tough challenge. Professor Malcolm Chalmers of RUSI has said that the chickens of the 2010 and the 2015 SDRs have come home to roost. The conjunction of a dangerous geopolitical environment and a fiscal crisis, a severe fiscal crisis, is more serious than that faced by any defence review since the 1960s. And the terms of reference are quite revealing. So I'll just read them. The terms of reference to the SDR are as follows. The SDR will determine the roles, capabilities and reforms required by UK defence to meet the challenges, threats and opportunities of the 21st century, deliverable and affordable within the resources available to defence within the trajectory to 2.5%. So I have a few problems with these terms of reference. The first is that they are input constrained, which is an odd place to start. The second is, I think SDR, Strategic Defence Review, is a bit of a misnomer if you're not going to nest the SDR in grand strategy. And instead, what we have is an approach that is constrained into 6 broad tasks. Commitment to the nuclear deterrent, a NATO-first approach, reinforce homeland security, support to Ukraine, maintain defence ties to the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf and the Middle East, and deliver AUKUS. Now, these are all viable, valuable outcomes, but they're not nested within a broader sense of any grand strategy. And thirdly, there's that 2.5%. So just to situate 2.5%, in 1936, we were spending 2.9% of GDP on defence. In 1939, it rose to 9%. By 1945, it was 50%, and in 1990, it was 4%. Now, we are facing an era that looks and feels a little bit like the 1930s, and yet we are constraining ourselves to 2.5%. And the implications of that are essentially that even if we spend 2.7%, we won't be able to address the chronic lack of readiness in the British Armed Forces in the near future. So we've hobbled George right from the start with this defence review. Why have we chosen to do that? Well, I think that one of the consequences of us being this very lucky generation is that we suffer from, if you like, contemporary amnesia, both in the public and in our politicians. And we have lost sight of the fact that historically, this period is ahistorical, that sadly, war is the norm when it comes to human history. There are 5 things about it that we shouldn't forget. First of all, war is frequent. Peace is just a brief interlude between wars historically. So in the period between 900 and 1900, Russia as a country only had 25 years of uninterrupted peace. In the same period, England had, out of every 100 years, was at war for 56 of them. We know that wars are long. We have become accustomed to wars that last for 100 hours or 100 days. Most wars last longer than the First World War or the Second World War. We think back historically to the 30 Years' War, to the 100 Years' War. Wars are extraordinarily destructive. So in the 30 Years' War, 30% of the European population was killed. And wars spread and they metastasize. They don't stay neatly contained geographically. And wars are unbelievably expensive. We are supplying Ukraine with $3 billion worth of aid each year, but actually the real bill, when you take into account the consequences of energy and the effects of that war, it's actually costing us about $70 billion a year. And think back to that figure, what we were spending on defence at the end of World War II, 50%. We didn't stop repaying our loans, our World War II loans, until 2006. So it's good to avoid war, if you possibly can. And you avoid war by making sure that you can deter it. So my purpose isn't to scaremonger. It is, though, to force a discussion of what's needed to circumvent the tragedy that always befalls countries that are not prepared. It's not a counsel of despair. It's a call to wisdom and action. It's a call to inspire the extraordinary exertions that we need to make to avert tragedy. And my thesis, if you like, is that we are at a hinge in history. This is an epochal shift. And we're not in transition, because transition is from one steady state to another. We are in a world of flux that is a bit like the 1930s, as I've said, but actually maybe more like 1912. Because the one thing about the 1930s generation is they knew what war was. The reason that they signed up so happily to appeasement and to Munich and to Chamberlain is because they desperately wanted to avoid paying the price that theirs and previous generations had. But in 1912, you had this gilded generation who had no idea what war was like. And I think we're a bit like that. Or it's like 1760 and the birth of the first industrial revolution. And the trends and the drivers that we're seeing are much, much more extreme than we realize. They're the sort that leads to revolutions, and the clocks are running faster than we think. So there is peril, but there is also opportunity, and we have agency. So what are these drivers? Well, there are three of them. First of all, for the first time, we're living on a planet that is under pressure. No individual economy or country is immune to the consequences of the climate change shifts that we're seeing. The second driver is this transition that we're experiencing to the digital age. And I think we will look back on the 2020s and the 2030s as a turning point in human history as profound as the first industrial revolution. And there are two technologies in particular that are driving it. The first, of course, is artificial intelligence. It's a foundational technology for all the change that will follow, but also synthetic biology, which is allowing us to rewrite the very source code for human life itself. And then the third driver is that we are experiencing, if you like, a geopolitical recession. And that is being driven by this great power competition and this notion, going back to that quote by Thomas Hobbes, that the overarching authority that we've relied on to provide peace and stability, that scaffolding is collapsing. And the countries that could provide it, China can't and the US won't. And so we have to brace ourselves for a world that is far more unstable than anything that we've become used to. So if this is a geopolitical competition, what's the nature of the competition? Well, first of all, it's not just between blocs. We're beginning to see something that looks and feels like imperial powers, neo-imperial powers, driven by strongmen who are trying to exercise their strategic muscle. But it's more than about blocs or imperial powers. It's also a struggle between autocracies and democracies. The very international order that's kept us safe is in question. And if you don't believe me, just listen to what Sergei Lavrov said just after the revolution, the invasion of Ukraine. And he said, this is not about Ukraine. This is about the international order. So he said it up front. So who are the players in this competition? Well, you have the non-aligned, the pivot powers, the middle powers, the global south, as they're sometimes called. And these are resentful, and the autocracies, and they are fertile ground for the autocracies. Just look at how many have chosen to sign up to the BRICS at the last summit in Kazan. I mean, even countries like Indonesia, who are natural partners to us. Then you have the autocracies, and I've described at the heart of this axis that we talked about. So you've got China and President Xi, who essentially believes three, maybe four things. First of all, he is acutely aware of what happened to the Soviet Union at the fall of the Berlin Wall, around glasnost and perestroika, and is determined in a period of political flux that shouldn't and couldn't happen to the Chinese Communist Party. So he's got a tighter grip and won't go down that route. Secondly, he is convinced that the United States is opposed to the rise of China in any and all circumstances, and so there is an implacable enmity. Third, that the West is in permanent decline and will remain in decline. And fourth, that the rise of the East is inevitable. Then you have Russia and Putin, and we'll come back to talk about him, but he has three aims that I'll go on to describe later on. But I think the consequences of those aims that he's pursuing means that peace with Russia under Putin's leadership is simply not possible. Third, you have Iran, weakened, but therefore very dangerous. And then you have the People's Republic of Korea, so North Korea, who seasoned Korea watchers believe they believe that Kim has taken a decision to go to war. It's just a question of the timing. And then you have the status quo powers, the West, if you like. And that's the US and its allies, but of course this is where President Trump makes his first entrance. And let's talk about President Trump for a little bit, because I'm sure we will in questions. So it's almost impossible. I mean, the amount of effort that is expended by analysts trying to work out what Trump is thinking is often, I think, wasted, because as somebody said, often his mind is nothing more than 6 fireflies going beep inside a glass jar. I didn't say that. But he is a character who tends to be impressed by people he respects and often takes the last view. So you've seen that. You know, the last conversation he had before Pete Hegseth made his announcement in Europe yesterday, and Trump's tweet, the last person he spoke to was Putin. He admires Putin. He wanted to please Putin. The reason he put out that tweet, which basically parrots all of Putin's lines, is because he listens to the last person he spoke to. There's an anecdote which I might share with you in questions afterwards around how he did the same thing essentially around Gaza with someone he respects as well. So how do we know what he's thinking? Well, often the best guide to what someone is thinking are the people he chooses for his team. This notion that people are policy. But of course, it doesn't really work, or it certainly didn't work as a guide in Trump's first term, because nobody lasted. I mean, 80% of the people who were put into his appointments had gone by the time he got to the end of his administration. And he likes to run a court of factions that disagree and fight with each other. So you have MAGA nativists against the tech bros, and you're already seeing some of those tensions start to play out. So his guide, who he chooses, whether it's Hegseth or Tulsi, what's her name? Gabbard, thank you, isn't necessarily a guide either. But there are some assumptions that we can make. The first, and we're starting to see all of these proven already, the first is that he will be unconstrained in his approach. He will be much more organized and much more effective in governing, but also governing well beyond the bounds of what the Constitution and the Founding Fathers intended. Secondly, that he will be vengeful, and we are seeing that already. He is taking steps to purge the deep state, and whether that happens in the Pentagon, and I think it soon will, it's already happening in justice, in the FBI, and of course, the demise of USAID. Third, his instincts are those of a mercantilist. So he sees allies not as allies or partners, but as trade adversaries. And he sees no value, no inherent value in alliances. He thinks allies are just relatives that come round and use your pool for free. So if US power is no longer exceptionalist, or if the US is no longer an exceptionalist power, it does mean this is at the end of the West as an organizing idea in international affairs. Or at the very least, it means that you have to sign up as a select partner to a US-led economic and security commons with a few other close allies. But that means you can't diverge. You can't have your own policy. You have to essentially be a slave, a vassal state of the US. Or you take the idea that Michael Ignatieff proposed of that he's beginning to describe spheres of hemispheric security. So the United States gets North and South America, you cede Eurasia to Russia, and you cede the Indo-Pacific and East Asia to China. And that means that the US can truly look inwards rather than outwards. But let's look for let's channel a bit of energy and jury and reasons to be cheerful. There are some things to be encouraged by. He has got, even if he misuses it, he's got a decisive mandate, and he's got legitimacy, and we didn't see any of the horrors that we thought might play out at the end of the US election. He's somebody who says, I don't start wars, I end them. I mean, as long as you end wars on the right terms, that's a good thing. That's something to admire. And look at his record. You know, he did go after ISIS. He did kill Soleimani. He did establish the Abraham Accords. He was the first US president ever of all of those who've called them for them to get NATO countries or European countries to start spending more than 2%. And there is something in this sort of blend of ego and a desire for a legacy and possibly a Nobel Peace Prize that you can exploit. There may be some ingredients for some genuine geopolitical alchemy, some grand strategic bargains, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in Ukraine, and some strategic realignment. But there are some risks, and I think we're starting to see them play out. The first is that his brand of strongman nationalism creates a permissive environment for nationalism all around the world, and particularly close to home in Europe for us. The second is that his rollback of US democracy, and we are seeing it, has a global impact and begins to fuel this autocratic trend that we're seeing. The third is that his approach undermines international cooperation right at the time when we need it most, whether that's on artificial intelligence or whether it's on climate change and energy transition. And the fourth is that a transactional approach to foreign policy, and that's what I think this is, without any guiding values or principles, is a recipe for chaos. So, what's the prescription? Well, John Bew said, much as we may wish it to be the case, we are not in a rule of law era today. Instead, raw power is being asserted everywhere we look. So, how can we shape the world, the events, through our own sense of purpose? Well, I think, first of all, we shouldn't discard the things that have kept us safe for this long. You know, we should reinforce those twin pillars of the UK's post-war grand strategy. Cleave to the US, no matter how distasteful it may feel sometimes. And secondly, restore the UK as a critical pillar of European security and as a trade partner. But we can also afford to be a little bit promiscuous geopolitically. So that means that we should remain an active and engaged partner. We should try to reinforce the global institutions, the multilateral partnerships and the rule of law that keep smaller and middle-sized countries safe from the predation of carnivores, whether that's in the Gulf, in the Indo-Pacific. We should avoid, as a country, adopting a defensive crouch. Think of those strengths I described. We should be confident and we should be bold. We are, an influential middle power with global reach. But we also, to do all of that, have to address some of the foundations that are weakening us at the moment. And that begins with the economy, because without an economy, the sinews of war just snap and start to fray. And we have to address and mitigate the economic consequences of Brexit one way or another, because in a world where we are an independent player and the big power blocks or trading blocks are the Chinese, the Americans and the EU, we are just a meal to be taken. Now, the good news in all of this is defense can contribute to growth. It can be an engine. And so this idea of, third thing, creating freedom's forge, I'm stealing an idea from the Americans, but the notion that we should as a nation be much better and can be much better at harnessing productive force, both as a national effort, but crucially as part of a European effort. And that's focusing on three areas: armaments, energy, and technology, and particularly AI. Because if you're not playing in technology, you will be a rule taker, a norm taker, rather than a rule or a norm maker. And we are in a position to be able to help make the rules when it comes to technology. And then fourth, we need to recover the role, the leadership role that we have been playing hitherto up until about 6-9 months ago when it comes to Ukraine. It's all very well to declare a 100-year partnership, but if you're standing there as a bystander while Yalta is played out in front of your eyes between Trump and Putin, you're not making much of an effort. And Ukraine really is the fulcrum for everything in this geopolitical recession that we're seeing. We can tip it back, the scales back the right way, but remember what Lavrov said, this is not about Ukraine, this is about the international order. And Macron's worth listening to, and he genuinely is. He said, nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine. For those of you who don't speak French, we cannot, as Europeans, allow Russia to win in Ukraine. And he's right. So we have to think about this in a different way. What is the cost of losing against the price of peace? Well, the cost of losing is that you let Putin win, and Putin has three goals. The first is reducing Ukraine to being a vassal state if it exists at all as a state. This isn't about territory, this is about Ukraine's very existence as a state. Secondly, to restore what he would describe as Novorossiya, what we would call Imperial Russia. And the third aim is to dismantle the Euro-Atlantic security order that has kept us safe. And he will pursue each of those three goals in the course of these discussions, this negotiation, and at the moment we're rewarding him. And the cost of losing, if that happens, is on three levels. On a geostrategic level, then these notions of independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity that we all signed up to in 1975 at Helsinki no longer count for anything. At a regional level, Europe, which has always had centrifugal tendencies, but the EU and NATO has kept them centripetal, begins to fly apart. And you begin to see the very existence of the EU and the post-World War II settlement, and certainly NATO, then fraying and becoming at risk. And then on a practical level, just think about the consequences of what defeat means for Ukraine. You end up with a defeated, divided, destroyed, dismantled, and bitter Ukraine on Europe's doorstep. You end up with Russia, not just with the minerals, but with 25% of the world's grain. We have to absorb 5 to 8 million refugees into Europe. So what's the price of victory? Well, counterintuitively, and it's a terrible thing to say, but it might be that keeping Ukraine in the fight for the rest of this year is a better option than handing Russia a defeat. Because I think a sustainable peace at the moment, and with Putin in the position he's in at the moment, is vanishingly unlikely. Just think about those three objectives. And what we're seeing at the moment is Yalta playing out around our ears. But there are some checks that we can apply. The thing that Trump and his administration, or his incoming team, are most concerned about is having any kind of a strategic defeat or a fiasco like Afghanistan and Kabul run around their necks. And if Trump succeeds in handing, because he's naive or whatever else, a deal that looks like a defeat for Ukraine and a victory for Russia, that is what his legacy will be defined as a defeat in Ukraine. And you can play with that. But first of all, we have to get to a ceasefire. And then we have to, beyond that ceasefire, and let's not even try and contemplate all the things that we have to overcome, you've got to find, most importantly, some security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, the best security guarantee is, of course, membership of NATO and Article 5, but let's leave that for a second. Whatever peace ceasefire you end up with, and whatever security guarantees, they have to be credible and they have to be enforced. And of course, here's where we get to the notion of having some troops in Ukraine to enforce this. And there are some genuine challenges with this, because a peacekeeping force covering a 1,200 kilometre boundary is not an act of war, because we are talking about deterring war. You might end up with a tripwire force, but tripwires often don't work very well, because you end up with a fait accompli and then you have to retake a nuclear territory from a nuclear-armed Russia, or you end up with a force that is a genuine deterrent. But the problem with a force that is a genuine deterrent is it's coming at cost to NATO itself. And Russia will object to all of this. So there is no simple way through in the way that we're seeing painted in primary colours at the moment. What is the price of peace? It's 5 things. Continue to arm Ukraine. Use and seize the 300 billion that sits in banks in Belgium at the moment and use that to arm Ukraine and potentially in the long term to reconstruct it. Project force, so air defense cover over Western Ukraine, and train Ukrainians inside Ukraine. It's worth dwelling for a second on the training issue. So at the moment, the most training that Ukrainians get is 6 weeks. Nobody who went ashore on D-Day had anything less than 22 weeks of training. So if you think there's a problem with morale in the Ukrainian armed forces, and there is in some parts of it, it's partly because they're simply not being given the training that they deserve to have to fight against these orcs, as the Ukrainians described them. 4th, security guarantees that if they're not NATO, need to be as close to NATO as we can make it. And then for European nations to be spending, and it's got to be more than 3%, but at least 3%. And why do we want to keep Ukraine in the fight? Because we haven't yet got to a point where there is a mutually hurting stalemate, which is the precondition you need for any peace settlement. In fact, at the moment, we're rewarding Putin and taking the pressure off him. And there is this myth that Russia doesn't lose. Russia never gives up. Russia can't lose. You look at history, that's just not true. They lost in Afghanistan. They lost in Chechnya. They lost the Cold War. And war is not linear. Things can change. And we know that Russia, and Putin in particular, is under acute pressure, mounting pressure. So the casualty rate at the moment is about 1,000 to 1,500 a day. By Victory Day, this great event in the Russian calendar, and deservedly so, victory over the Wehrmacht, over the Germans in the Second World War, Russia will have taken over 1 million casualties. That is not a great story to tell your people if you're Putin. And for what? Their casualty rate, they are taking 20 casualties for every Ukrainian casualty. Pound for pound, man for man, the Ukrainians are fighting much, much better than the Russians are. In fact, the Russians are only getting between 3 and 10 days of training. Why do they join? And they are joining because they earn 5 times the average wage in their area. They're being drawn from remote and distant parts, economically deprived parts of Russia. And if you're killed in service, your family gets $150,000 in compensation, and that is life-changing for families in those parts of the world. But that will and is beginning to dwindle. We know that their economy is tanking and will go into stagflation. Their weapon stocks, from the huge stocks they had, are now almost completely used up. They have a terrible labor crisis. So better to keep the pressure on Russia, keep the pressure on Putin, so that when he is forced to come to terms, they are terms that may lead to a sustainable and enduring peace. But common to any future is that whatever emerges, Russia will remain implacably hostile and will continue to wage a campaign that we're seeing, whether it's attacking our undersea infrastructure, arson, or assassination. So our long-term strategy has to be based around containment. So the 5th thing we have to do is to restore deterrence. And this is where the SDR comes in. And for it to be effective, we need a ruthlessly honest appraisal of where we are. Now, there are some positives, and we should bank these positives. First of all, between us, Europe and the USA, amount to 50% of global wealth. NATO spends more on defense than Russia and China combined. The international community resolve versus Ukraine is still, up until now, has still been remarkable. NATO's stronger, with Finland and Sweden in. These are security providers, not security consumers. And they create a depth in NATO and a dilemma for Russia and for Putin. European defense spending has gone up by 400 billion since 2014, and we're seeing play out in Ukraine, but also in the way that Israel took down Iran's air defense system, a new way of fighting that means that we can beat countries like Russia. But this ruthlessly honest appraisal also has to acknowledge that in terms of our conventional forces, we have been hollowed out. We are a Potemkin force. And we have to, and we've also been giving stuff away, and we haven't replaced it, any of it. So we've got to do a number of things. We've got to restore our stockpiles. we've got to get after our neighbours, we've got to invest in our infrastructure, we've got to restore mass, because that's what Ukraine tells you, that war is a battle of attrition, and having an industrial base is critical. So how do we restore deterrence by 2030? And the significance of 2030 is that's the point at which most people anticipate the Russians will have reset, and is also a potential window of crisis around Taiwan. These, I think, to conclude, are the 5 things that George Robertson, that Fiona and Richard will have to be getting after and will be thinking about. 5 imperatives for the SDR. The first is we have to and we must privilege the continuous at-sea deterrence and its supporting capabilities. I started life not quite as a card-carrying member of CND, but I was certainly marching with them as a child or as a student. I think it's a great thing. Students should have these kind of radical views. I don't think like that anymore. I don't think CND exists. So privileging CASD in a world where your enemies, your adversaries, are all at the nuclear threshold or on it makes sense, where we think that nuclear proliferation is likely to play out over the next few decades, and where we can see that nuclear deterrence works, that has to be top of the list as an imperative for the SDR. Secondly, we've got to get a lot more serious about protecting the UK and protecting the home base, because defence starts at home. So that means doing some practical things, like hardening our critical defence infrastructure and not having the Air Force all parked on one base and the Army parked on another base. We've got to be able to harden it and disperse, and we've also got to be able to protect some of the critical national infrastructure, civilian infrastructure as well. It means being serious about having some form of integrated air and missile defence for the UK. Not an Iron Dome, because we're too big for an Iron Dome. Israel's about the size of Wales. You can just about cover Wales. You can't cover the whole of the UK. It's about more than ground-based air defence, but it does mean investing in a command and control system like we had with the Dowding system in World War II, appropriate sense and warn, and offensive counter-air capabilities for the RAF. And protecting the UK home base means going back to what we talked about when I talked about a year ago about conscription. What I really meant was engaging and mobilising society to acknowledge this sense of peril if you don't act, the importance of doing things to prevent war, like the Swedes, like the Finns have done so effectively, rekindling that sense of national resilience and national pride and a willingness to fight for our country. Finland describes that willingness to fight as the source code for their very existence, their nationality. 80% of Finns would volunteer to fight for their country. The last review, the last survey that the Times did, it's about 11% for this country. Now, I don't believe that. I think that this generation is as tough as any generation would be, the Gen Z generation, but we're not helping them by explaining things properly, and that's the role of institutions like Newcastle University, amongst others. The third imperative is to focus on our near-term readiness, not long-term bets on technology in the future, and that's where our programme is currently skewed at the moment. Most of the stuff that we're investing in will not emerge until the 2030s, and in some cases the 2040s. We have to focus on the here and now and our short-term readiness. And that means munitions. So for that, we need an industrial base, which is more than just the primes, like British Aerospace. Where are Armstrongs and our Vickers today? We've allowed them to atrophy. You know, the US, up until about 30 years ago, they had companies that would produce dual-use technologies. So Chrysler produced cars and missiles. Ford produced cars and satellites. General Mills, which is a cereal company, produced artillery. We can do this. We showed that we can do dual-use technologies in the pandemic. We're just choosing not to at the moment. We've got to invest in our maintenance, in our training, in our strategic enablers, and we've got to restore depth and mass. And yes, that does mean having at least the plans in place to generate a strategic reserve, a second echelon, if you like, a citizen army. And through all of that, we've got to continue arming Ukraine, as I've said. Fourth imperative, we've got to put NATO first. Yes, we are a global power. Yes, we have global interests, but defence begins at home, and that's through NATO. That's how we keep safe. So we've got to contribute to NATO in Europe. And that's a combination of what the UK needs for homeland defence, what the UK needs to protect the continuous at sea deterrent, but also capabilities that we can bring that offset an inevitable US tilt to the Indo-Pacific, and taking account of what our allies can do better than us. So Poland can probably do big armies better than we can. But that's not a license for role specialization. It's not a license to adopt a purely maritime strategy, because if you want to see yourself as a major NATO member, and I think we do, and as the US begin to lift off, it's imperative that we help out, then you've got to be able to contribute to all missions and in all domains. And that's to hedge against any division, so that if you get NATO members who aren't willing to apply Article 5, it's so that we have some sovereign choice, and that means that having commitments on land as much as at sea and in the air are essential. And by the way, we could find ourselves having to contribute to some sort of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine as well. And the fifth and final imperative is to focus on technologies that are quick win, not those that only deliver in the 2030s or the 2040s, because we don't have enough time to modernize at that pace. How do we make the force that we have, the armored vehicles that I've been serving in my entire career, which were made in the 1950s, how can we use technology to make those 10 times more lethal? Through spiral development, through DevSecOps, through draping these things with digital technology, by using networks that connect any sensor to any effector, artillery system, missile, whatever it is, and any person who's going to decide, all enabled by AI. Because we will see we are seeing a Cambrian explosion in autonomous systems. So, all very cheerful. I'll leave you with three thoughts. This is expensive. This comes at significant cost. The real figure that defence needs probably to put its house in order and to address the decline that we've suffered for the last 15 years is somewhere between 3 and 4%. And we're choosing to spend money on guns rather than on butter. But the alternative is so much worse. And we have to pay the price of some of the oversights and the mistakes and the complacency of our politicians and indeed the voting public. But the good news is that national security is also economic prosperity. Secondly, we have to rekindle our sense of tragic sensibility if we are going to inspire the extraordinary aversions to avert tragedy. We have got time, we have got agency, and we are building on very, very strong foundations in the three services that we have. You can be very proud, I am, of the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the British Army. And thirdly, let's not be a cautionary tale for historians to look at in future. Let's not be what Mark Bloch described in Strange Defeat in 1942. The future is in our hands. Remember what Kissinger said. A nation which does not shape events through its own sense of purpose eventually will be engulfed in events shaped by others. We still have time to avert that. Thank you.